This lecture is part of Chapter 9. It is specifically on sources of prejudice. So let's define prejudice. I know we defined that in an earlier lecture, but let's remind ourselves of this definition. Prejudice is an attitude, a combination of feelings, inclinations to act, and beliefs. A prejudiced person may feel dislike toward those different from themselves and behave toward them in a discriminatory manner, believing them ignorant and dangerous. So let's look at why does prejudice occur? Again, what are the sources of prejudice? Well, there are social sources. The social dominance orientation says this is a dispositional tendency to accept and even prefer circumstances that sustain social inequalities, combined with a general preference for hierarchical social structures. So in other words, someone with a social dominance orientation believes there are hierarchies in society, and these must be maintained. Simply put, they believe some people are better than others, therefore that helps increase their own self-esteem. And this could occur in several areas. Status breeds prejudice, especially for people high in social dominance orientation. So there could be social dominance orientation related to someone's nationality, related to their religion, related to their sexuality, their level of ability, their skin color, their gender, where they live, economic class, and their race. So people with a social dominance orientation, again, believe that there should be a hierarchy. Essentially, some people are better than others, and that can result in prejudice against a different class. Socialization, the process beginning during childhood by which individuals acquire the values, habits, and attitudes of a society. Someone might simply be prejudiced because that's what they learned from their family or other caregivers. And I really like the quote next to it. Your job as a parent is to teach your child to love others. Unfortunately, there are parents out there who teach their child to hate others, and that is so sad. So a source of prejudice may just be that that's how you were raised, and so you take on those beliefs. Another source of prejudice might be conformity. So even if if someone doesn't learn to be prejudiced as a child, they might still become prejudiced in order to conform to their social group. If prejudice is socially accepted, many people will follow the path of least resistance and conform to the fashion. They will follow social norms not out of a need to hate, but out of a need to be liked and accepted by their social group. Also, another social source of prejudice, sometimes social institutions. That would be things like schools, government, families, may bolster prejudice through overt policies, such as segregation, or by passively reinforcing the status quo. And that's usually called institutional prejudice or institutional discrimination, which most of you have probably heard of that concept. So beyond some social sources of prejudice, what are some motivational sources of prejudice? Why are we motivated to be prejudiced sometimes? Scapegoating. Scapegoating is defined as the act of transferring responsibility for one's failures or frustrations onto a vulnerable group, often as a means of deflecting our own guilt. This phenomenon can manifest in prejudiced beliefs, where individuals perceive themselves as victims and blame others for societal issues. Essentially, it can be easier to blame our failures on an external or vulnerable group than taking ownership of those failures. And that obviously can produce a negative feeling or prejudice toward that group. Also, there is realistic group conflict theory. This is a framework that is predicated on the assumption that intergroup tensions will occur whenever social groups must compete for scarce resources. Resources might include food, where you live, jobs, wealth, power, and that this competition fuels prejudice and other antagonistic attitudes that lead to conflicts, such as rivalries and warfare. So essentially within a group, you're having to compete for different resources, such as food. And so you're going to become prejudiced against those people you're competing with just because you've developed this negative attitude toward them since they're your competition. Social identity, our self concept, which is our sense of who we are, contains not just a personal identity, a sense of our personal attributes and attitudes, but also a social identity. In other words, we define ourselves by our groups. In group is the groups we associate ourselves with. Out groups are groups we do not associate with. And we are, of course, biased toward our own group. We tend to see our own group as superior because that increases our self-esteem and helps us feel better. So our out groups, we could learn to be prejudiced against because we want to see ourselves as better. So those are some motivational sources of prejudice. Let's look at some cognitive sources of prejudice. Stereotyping. Why do we do that? One way we simplify our environment is to categorize things, to organize the world by clustering objects into groups. Stereotypes represent cognitive efficiency. They are energy-saving schemes for making speedy judgments and predicting how others will think and act. It's worth noting that we tend to judge people in out-groups more harshly and quickly than we do people in our own in-group. It's also important to note that in general, the greater our familiarity with a social group, the more we see its diversity, and the less our familiarity, the more we stereotype. In other words, the more we're familiar with someone who's different from us, the less likely we are to stereotype. And then the more, if we're not that familiar, the more likely we are to stereotype. Distinctiveness. We tend to especially notice those that are different from us. Of course, this would be an out-group, someone different from us, and we're more likely to be prejudiced against someone in an out-group. As it mentions, we know from the previous slide, as I just mentioned, we're more likely to be biased toward our in-group. We tend to think they're better because obviously that can increase our self-esteem. The fundamental attribution error can also lead to prejudice. I won't go into that now because it's a pretty lengthy concept to discover, and you can see the Chapter 3 lecture entitled Attribution Theory for a full explanation of this error. But that's also another cognitive source of prejudice. The just world hypothesis is a psychological concept that suggests people tend to believe the world is fair and that people get what they deserve. This hypothesis is based on the idea that people have an innate need to believe that the world is a just place and that bad things only happen to bad people. This belief is often used to explain why people may feel less empathy for or be prejudiced against those who have suffered misfortune. For example, there's actually many examples. When someone is the victim of a crime, people may be more likely to blame the victim for their misfortune rather than the perpetrator. Additionally, people may be more likely to believe that those who are poor or homeless are responsible for their own situation, rather than attributing it to systemic issues. So that's an examples of the just world hypothesis, which is we tend to believe that people get what they deserve. If they're bad things happen, if bad behavior brings bad things, good behavior brings good things. So that makes us look down upon someone who's had something bad happen often because we think, well, bad behavior brings bad things. So kind of a complicated concept, but hopefully that gives you a little idea of the just world hypothesis. So that's the end of the lecture. As always, thank you for listening and let me know if you have any questions.